Welcome to EPG Pathshala. I am Parthopotim Bora from Department of Sociology, Dibrugarh University, Assam. The title of this module is Many Modernities, Sequential Theories, Goran Therborn, in the paper Contemporary Social Theory. So, we know that the idea of modernity had a root in the European context. So if we see the various theories that are associated with the understanding of the idea of modernity was criticized because how they are having a kind of Western bias. So the root of modernity that was seen in case of the theories of modernity was basically assumed that all the societies will have a kind of linear progress, and this root of linear progress was given by the European context. Say for example, we can talk about the theories that were initially developed, whether it is a context of economy or whether it is a context of psychology. All of them were basically discussing the linear European model of progression. And this linear European model of progression was later on criticized across the different parts of the globe. It was basically the history of decolonization that brought the new understanding to that of modernity. So it means that the modernity, the idea of modernity is not only the European modernity. We need to take into account the context of the non-European societies or the context of the colonized societies who, after their decolonization, started their own idea of modernity. Say for example, if we take how the linear stages model where the societies were progressed from the traditional to the modern society, it is seen that the kind of progress is not linear but it is multiple in its nature. In such a context, it is significant to understand the work of Goran Therborn. In fact, the Goran Therborn is well known for his understanding of modernity in the context of multiple modernity. But he also is different from the various other theories who talk about the multiple modernities, because it is also his sequential theorizing which make his understanding different from the other theories of his time who are trying to give the theories of multiple modernity. So along with the idea of multiple modernity, which is rooted in the European as well as non-European context or in the colonized society, Therborn also talk about how the sequential theorizing need to be taken into account in order to understand the multiple modernity. So the basic aim of this module will be to introduce the Goran Therborn's sequential theorizing that help to establish modernity as a plural phenomenon. His analytical tool entangle modernities and disentangling entanglements, and the four grand narratives of modernity in recent times and a sequential theorizing of Europe seek to draw our attention to the fact that multiple modernities exist instead of linear progressive modernity with its origin in Europe. So while talking about entangled modernities or disentangling entanglement, he was basically criticizing the four grand narratives of modernity. So in such a context, Goran Therborn see the modernity as a kind of plural in its nature. So it is not a kind of linear or progress. The multiple modernity talk about the plural nature of the concept of modernity that we need to take into account with reference to the plural societies. For the intellectual like Therborn, Eisenstein, Dierlich of the present times talk about modernity in a plural. Modernity as such a concept was mostly understood in the sense of temporal progress and as that which had its origin in the West. There was a notion of historical development as a progressive and linear, within which was embedded the idea of modernity. In this context, colonizing countries from the Western world who sought to enlighten the colonized countries with education and their ideas of health, religion, etc. were invested with a sense of superiority and so were their cultural symbol. So basically, we can see that how Therborn's idea, so basically we can see how the Therborn idea was critical of the linear progress in terms of the temporality. So how it sees the temporal progress in case of the modern theory as a linear. So that temporal progress was criticized by the Therborn, especially in the context of the colonization or the process of colonization. He said that when the colonizing countries try to have or try to make the progress in the colonized world in terms of the linear progress in the field of education, health, religion, etc., they were basically using the model of Europe. And he see this understanding of the linear temporal progress that is rooted in the European context as problematic one. Talking of not much back in time, former sociological theories like Anthony Giddens also presented a Eurocentric definition of modernity as that which referred to a mode of social life or organization which emerged in Europe from about 17th century onward and which subsequently became more or less worldwide in their influence. Subsequently, a new breed of intellectual emerged who regarded such trend of thought as problematic. So if we see one of the most dominant theorists of modernity in the contemporary time, that is the Anthony Giddens, Therborn argues that even the work of Anthony Giddens is problematic because he was basically having a linear progress model of modernity which is Eurocentric in its nature. So that because of that, this linear understanding of the Eurocentric definition of modernity given by Anthony Giddens was problematic, and as a result Therborn tried to subsequently modify the understanding of modernity on the basis of the criticism he raised against such theories including Giddens. So such theories argued that with decolonization, since the Second World War, the voices of the colonized came to be recognized and the histories of hitherto invisible and the backward cultures, societies, people which coexisted spatially and temporally with the Eurocentric modernization discourse were restored. Thus, they talked of modernity not only in plural, making possible the thought of multiple modernities from various cultures and societies at the same time, but also as that which valorize the perspective of tradition and civilizational legacies. So in such a context, the multiple modernity talk about how with the processes of decolonization, the voices of the non-West or of that of the colonized or the colonies started getting importance. So in that context, it is not only talk about the idea of multiple modernity, it also talk about how the culture of the colonies started getting importance within the whole discourse of modernity. So it is not like that only the colonial masters culture were getting important, but rather how the multiple culture were getting important in the contemporary time, especially after the starting of the process of decolonization. So in such a history or in such a social context which is rooted in the history of colonization and decolonization, the significance of the idea of multiple modernity propagated by Goran Therborn lies in that it basically talk about the need to understand the idea of how we can see the importance of the culture across the various societies. Now let us have a brief introduction to Goran Therborn. Goran Therborn is a professor emeritus of sociology at the University of Cambridge, UK, and affiliated professor of sociology at Linnaeus University, Sweden. According to Barrow, Therborn's work constitutes a key transitional link between structuralism and derivationist project. Therborn is also celebrated as civic intellectual who has exhibited a lifetime commitment to universal freedom and equality. He has been a supporter of anti-imperialist and egalitarian social movement and has written on the Marxist and radical theory. So one of the significant contributions of Therborn is that he was basically a civic intellectual, And being a civic intellectual, he was always supporting the idea of equality as well as the idea of freedom. Being civic intellectual, another important characteristics of work of Therborn was how he was supporting all the social movement which were either anti-imperialist in its nature or which were basically against the nature of inequalities that are present in our society. So that was one of the significant character of the academic work as well as the intellectual work that was done by Therborn. And in that context, we can also see how his work can be placed within the broader domain of radical Marxism, whereby the Marxism was not need to be seen only as a kind of academic discourse, rather it need to be rooted in the practice. So his support of the anti-imperialist movement as well as the support of the movement that are associated with the inequalities, against inequality, he was basically adopting the approach of radical Marxism. His research interest includes pathways into and out of modernity, capital cities as representation of power, global process of inequality, as well as other global processes and comparison, particularly of sex, gender, family relation, contemporary radical thought, and forces of possible change. So his interest ranges in the diverse field, from starting from that of the idea of inequality, how the cities work as a center of power, as well as the different forms of inequality like family, gender, as well as he also tried to see there is a possibility of the radical change, how there is a possibility of radical change in the society. Now let us discuss the idea of sequential theories and multiple modernities. As a sociologist and commentator of incredible repute of current times, Goran Therborn has been interested in events vis-a-vis their histories that have contributed to consequences. He is interested in how these events affect us and our worldview today, as well as in the socio-historical waves that they have created. It is in this very vein that he approached the discourse on modernity. Dismissing Eurocentric linear definition of modernity, he stated that modernity is better defined as time orientation instead of as a set of institutions. But modernity in non-European sense entails several different competing master narrative, different social forces of and conflict between modernity and anti-modernity, and different cultural contextualization of the past-future contrast. But these different varieties do not simply coexist and challenge each other. They are entangled with each other in various ways. For him, modernity does not per se designate a particular chronological period or any particular institutional forms. In principle, defined period of modernity followed by demodernization, re-traditionalization are conceivable. So, in the understanding of sequential theory or his understanding of multiple modernities, we can see how the Goran Therborn was basically looking at how the various phases of modernity does not always work in the sequential manner. So in that context, we can also talk about how the non-Eurocentric idea of modernity can exist. So it is not a kind of linear temporal progress, rather we need to see the multiplicity while talking about the sequential theories of modernity. Therborn asserts that multiplicity of modernities could be approached in many different ways, and that his own work has concentrated on different processes of emergence and their consequences, on the different discourse of past and future contrast. But at the root of Therborn conceptualization of modernity is the assumption that modernity is a global phenomena. Therborn distinguishes between global and the universal as follows. Globality is characterized by fine and connectivity, while universality is characterized by unlimited extension. Therborn looked at modernity as a global phenomena instead of universal one. Thus, which means that in understanding modernity, one should consider focusing on global variability, global connectivity, and global intercommunication, a global loop at a process of change and continuity and discontinuity. And it is this very association between the global and modernity which make the modernity a site of conflict and contestation. So we can see how, while understanding the idea of modernity, Therborn basically trying to distinguish the idea of global and the idea of universal. How the idea of global is defined from that of universal is basically the unlimited expansion of universal that differentiates them from the global, which is basically have the finite or the limited scope. And he said that there is an attempt to see the idea of modernity with the global. So it has a basically the limited scope in terms of the connectivity, and this limited scope of the modernity as a global is creating the contestation or creating the problem in our society. So he said that the modernity is not seen as an universal category, rather the modernity is seen as a global category. So global is multiple because of the connectivity or because of the specificity or limited in its extension. And when we relate the modernity with global, it has some contestation or conflict, and that he tries to deal in his understanding of multiple modernities. Therborn attempts an understanding of multiple modernities through sequential theories, where he argues that human population and social systems exist in time and space. The structure as well as the culture of human population have spatial and temporal dimension. Spatial aspect of social structure and the culture refer to the territorial extension, boundaries, and the territorial distribution or configuration of resources and constraints, and of identities, knowledge and values respectively. Time also has an extension, duration, boundaries of enabling and beginning, or of being in and out of state, and configuration, that is its sequence. And his study of Europe and modernity is a classic example of understanding the phenomena through the sequential theories, where the focus on the issue of integration, convergence, divergence, extension, interlinkages of the different cultural dimension across the state boundaries. So in his sequential theory, Therborn was basically looking at the spatial as well as the temporal dimension that exists in the social system as well as the human population. So while talking about the spatial dimension, he was basically talking about the boundaries, how the boundaries exist in case of space or in terms of geographical area. But on the other hand, there is also another aspect, that is the temporal boundary, how the boundary exists in terms of time. So these two boundaries, one in terms of space or the area, that how they define the boundary, and another how the boundary is defined in terms of time, is actually his important component of understanding sequential theories. And basically in such a context, he was giving the example of European context, how in European context the boundaries that are seen in case of spatial as well as temporal context need to be seen in case of divergence, convergence that were taking place in the European society, not only in terms of the spatial boundary but also in the terms of temporal boundaries. So this kind of divergence and the integration as well as convergence also need to be kept in mind. Now let us discuss the four grand narrative on modernity that was given by Therborn. While arguing multiple modernities, Therborn brings to our notice four major master narrative of modernity in recent history, is embodying an alternative to the modern conception of time. Through these narratives, Therborn seeks to analyze the process of emergence of modernity and their consequences, and maintain how this narrative contain discourses of past future contrast. The four grand narrative are: the first one, the European Enlightenment narrative. It shows the heteronomy and the oppression in the past and emancipation and the liberation in the future. Then the Kantian narrative. It spoke of the poverty, ignorance, the stagnation in the past, progress, evolution and the growth in the future. Then the third one is the competitive narrative. This perspective belief Therborn developed in the last third of the 19th century in the social Darwinism, in competitive imperialism, and then in fascism. The fourth one is the modernism as a cultural ideology narrative. This narrative is supposed to have been drawn from the late 19th century Europe and America, and projects a worldview of modernism as a cultural ideology, or of artistic vanguardism and of fashion. So these are the four kind of narrative of the modernity given by Therborn. One is the European Enlightenment narrative, second is the Kantian narrative, third one is the competitive narrative, and fourth one is the modernism as a cultural ideology narrative. Therborn, while dwelling upon this master narrative of modernity, point out that each of these narrative is free from single-mindedness. That is, each of them is aware about the dialectics between the past and the present. Each contains the contextual element specific to the location, element that exhibit integration, convergence, divergence, extension and interlinkages of defined cultural dimension. Now let us see how Therborn basically approached modernities as a historical conflict between tradition and modernity. Carrying on his interest in the sequential theories, where he considered different processes of emergence and their consequences, and of different discourses of the past-future contrast, Therborn knows that another approach towards understanding of multiple modernities is from the angle of historical conflict between the modernity and tradition, or between modernity and anti-modernity. In this regard, he distinguishes four main conflictual alignments in the world that can be located in a logical space and could be used as an ideal type, although he admits that country may have passed through more than one route. He called this for geohistorical approach that deal with the route to and through the modernity in the world, and he talked of the following routes: the European route to civil war, the route through anti-modernity of the settler society, modernity through colonial conquest, and modernity carried forth by the native. Therborn does talk about these four routes that entail a conflict between tradition and modernity, between modernity and anti-modernity, through which countries march towards or through modernity. And just as he maintained that a country can go through more than one of these routes, he professes that different modernities have defined others as obstacles or as categories of reference, which but point to the plurality inherent in the understanding of modernity. Therborn breaks the myth about the linear modernization processes in the Europe by sequentially analyzing converging and diverging patterns in the continent through three empirical levels. One is the structural level, second is the institutional level, and third is the social level. So at the structural level, he talks about basically, even though modern social indicator for health, labor market, income, security, etc. have been framed for the whole Europe, huge differences exist among the countries over this basic living and the working condition. Secondly, while talking about the institutional level, he talks about the institution of education has gone through a similar process of expansion all over Europe. Decline in the proportion of the low education or the improvement in the relative position of the women. Yet, the timing of educational differences has differed, and the differences have remained in the national educational structure, with the European Union exhibiting a little power determining the content of education. Now talk about the social level. Dilhe and Kohler's findings relate that most people in Europe continue to compare their own living conditions within the national frame of reference, although a growing minority is beginning to take into consideration the living conditions in other countries. Let us discuss the idea of entangled modernities. Through the Therborn study of Europe, we see how the notion of modernity are not progressive or linear, but varied and entangled. He in fact proposed entangled modernities as an analytical tool to study the phenomena of modernity. In Therborn's word, entangled modernities is a focus of reflection, investigation and analysis from different angles with different eyes and with an open-ended, expectedly variable outcome. With the concept of entangled modernities, Therborn seeks to grasp events in history with a wide interdisciplinary grip relating culture and social institution and social conflict. Now let us discuss the idea of disentangling entanglement. According to Therborn, entanglement to be used analytically should be disentangled. He distinguishes three kinds of entanglement of the modernity. Each manifests itself in several forms: space of entanglement, processes producing entanglement, and effect of entanglement. He admits that while disentangling entanglements, one should proceed with two major analytical perspectives, by looking at the institution, and second one is by looking into the people's mind or into enculturations. Thus, in this module, we basically discuss the idea of modernity, idea of multiple modernity, as well as the sequential theories as developed by Goran Therborn. Goran Therborn's understanding of multiple modernity is not only different from the earlier Eurocentric understanding of modernity, but he is also different from the various multiple modernities or the various theories of multiple modernity presented during his time. So his idea of multiple modernity need to be seen as a kind of critique to the sequential theory of modernity, whereby the modernity was seen only as a product of the European history. On the other hand, along with the context of decolonization, he also talked about how the modernity need to be understood both at the spatial as well as in the temporal dimension. So both in the spatial as well as temporal dimension, he talked about how the multiple modernity can exist. And in the last part of the module, we are discussing the idea of entanglement and disentangling entanglement, which was a kind of new development or a new concept that was developed by Goran Therborn in the context of understanding multiple modernity. So the whole discourse on multiple modernity presented by the Goran Therborn will help you to know or will help you to have a new perspective to have a understanding of the multiple modernity in the across the globe. Thank you.